How's it been? What's it been, like 2-3 months since my last video? Did you miss me? Well, it's because making an hour-long video about a topic that no one's gonna watch or like is very mentally and physically taxing, because I know it's not gonna get viewed unless I sell my soul to some sort of evil, unholy deity. But that's okay, because I'm about to make a video that's way smaller and it will hurt my ego far less. This is the Steam controller, made by Valve to solve the self-proposed question, what if we made a controller and you did the rest? Depending on whose hands this is in, this is either one of the best controllers you can get your hands on, or an unusable paperweight. Personally, I really like this thing, but unless you like to deal with things that only work when you put some time into not only learning how to use it, but how to configure it too, this thing is about as good as just a handheld laptop trackpad. The Steam controller was a very niche and odd product because it existed essentially to cross a mouse and a keyboard and a controller so that you can comfortably play games on your couch on Valve's new Steam machines. Considering it's been 2-3 months since I uploaded my Steam machine video and the thing has been sitting in my living room collecting dust because it doesn't have much use outside of it being an emulation device, I'm sure you can see how that went. But the Steam controller is its own product. It also failed, but did it deserve to fail like the Steam machine? I'd really argue it didn't. Aside from the execution barrier to setting this thing up, I really enjoy the Steam controller. So let's get negatives out of the way here, because I think there's more positives to negatives. First of all, this thing feels cheap. All of my life, I've used many gadgets, gizmos, doohickeys, whatchamacallits. You know, all the words white people say. And not once could I have said, oh, this feels cheap, because it's not something I really associate with tech when I'm holding it. I can tell something is cheaply made by appearance or how the experience is using it, but this is the first time I actively can say this feels cheap. It feels like those Fisher-Price toys that are shaped like controllers for gamer parents who want to indoctrinate their child into their epic gamer lifestyle of buying broken games on release and having a Funko Pop collection. The controller just feels absurdly light, especially when you remove the batteries, which also just feel like I'm gonna break the controller just putting them in and taking them out. The paddles are literally just bendable plastic that is snapped to the back of the controller and presses buttons under this area. The buttons aren't even invisible. The face buttons definitely are buttons and you can press them. The analog stick is alright enough, okay? But oh my god, these bumpers feel like I'm breaking them every time I push them. They have this distinct click, like they're cracking, and I don't like it at all. When I'm playing with this thing, I love the feeling in my hands despite the cheap feeling. I kind of forget and get into the groove of how this thing feels and controls until I press the bumpers. I really mean it that I hate pressing these. It's the one thing on this controller I outright dislike. If I could mod this controller to change these bumper buttons to not be this garbage, I'd do that in a heartbeat. They are that bad. Mad Catz controllers feel more sturdy than this. But aside from the build quality, the main problem really comes from the actual programming of the controller. This controller, as you can see, doesn't have a second analog stick. So by default, the right stick is mapped to the trackpad on the right here, and it sucks. You have to swipe it like an actual mouse pad, but it feels like a controller and it never feels right. Some games map it a different way where a point in the trackpad is equivalent to the point you push on the stick. So the farther out you touch on the trackpad, the more to the edge the stick is. You can get used to this, but I really just don't see the reason to. And this is where the biggest problem comes in. You have to actually configure the Steam controller for every game you want to play. And in pretty much every case, you want the right trackpad to work as a mouse, and the rest of the controller to, well, be a controller. So you might think that would create 1 or 2 issues, no big deal, but no, this is an infinite amount of issues. That's not a joke. Every single game is made differently, and every single game also tackles the Steam controller differently. Because some games just handle mouse and keyboard and controller separately, some the same way, some don't have support for one or the other, and some games have issues for both of these control methods. The list just goes on. The most common issue is when you want to use a mouse on the trackpad and keep the controller as a controller. Some games just refuse to take both types of inputs at the same time, and you get jittery aiming and movement as the game swaps control inputs. Like, actually takes a second to swap. Here's how it is in Dying Light 2, it just makes playing with the Steam controller not something you want to do. Some people make community configs, but it's just the analog control on the trackpad, it just feels like garbage. It's not really a fix. Post-editing Snoozie here. This is sort of an addendum. Ever since the recent, major Steam update, it seems that they've kind of changed this, and I can't replicate it in the settings at all. I don't know how to. I'm sure I can somehow. because I'm pretty sure a lot of people played games like this, but I can't replicate it at all. I can't find out how. So I'm going to give you the best visual representation I can through my editor Canon here. Say hi, Canon. Hello. So right now I'm not touching the pad, and I'll show where I'm touching the pad with a visual of a little blue circle up here. And this is pretty much what would happen. I would touch the pad, and depending on how far away I am from the center of the circle, it'll pretty much input that precise input of the analog stick. And that's just how it would work. It was a very off-putting and confusing control method, but, you know, some people used it, and, yeah, I hope that explains it. A good PC port that supports the Steam controller will allow both types of inputs, but you'll see some funny things like this going on here in the corner, where if the HUD shows a button prompt, it'll swap from PC to controller. It's a minor issue, but it's a compromise I'm willing to make to use this. But that also means you have to set the controller up to even use it. So let's go through this together so you understand why this thing is just unintuitive and time consuming. So let's boot up our game. Let's also make it a game that has good support for the Steam controller. We also don't want something that actually has a good natural config for the Steam controller as well, like Deep Rock Galactic. Some games like DRG actually just have great support for the Steam controller right away, and we don't want that. We want to make this thing look bad through nitpicking. Let's choose Halo Infinite. Sadly, the Master Chief Collection has stuttery and jittery input swapping, so we just have to use Infinite here. So let's head into an empty match and see our controls. Alright, everything is mapped like a controller. We don't fucking want that. So let's open the Steam controller settings and start changing some things. First off, we want mouse movement on the trackpad. Don't want to complicate things, so let's also bind the right stick click to the right trackpad click. And that's it. That's all we need to do to make this playable on the Steam controller. That wasn't so bad, right? Well, that's a game that makes it easy on you, so let's look at something a bit more odd. This is The Evil Within. This is a game that I wanted to play with a mouse and keyboard, but I didn't like it at all with the keyboard, so setting up the controller with mouse controls was my go-to choice. But I also didn't really like this game entirely on controller. So first let's go into the settings and get that mouse bound to the right trackpad, right stick click to right trackpad click. And alright, let's get some gyro controls in here. Gyro would have been useful in Halo Infinite, but you know, I'm a bit of a stickler for it in a horror game with a controller. Having that gyro aim is going to help. Now gyro is set to enable when my controller is on the right trackpad, and personally, I don't like this. My finger is always on the trackpad, and I don't want gyro flinging me around because I span in my chair a little bit or I adjusted my setting position. So let's set gyro to full trigger pull. This means when I pull the trigger halfway, I'll aim, but if I want gyro aim, I have to pull it all the way. This lets me choose when and where I want to use gyro aiming. Okay, but The Evil Within also has a lot of items on the floor while I'm running around, and being able to move the camera while picking something up is important. So I'm going to have to map the pickup button to the back paddle here for convenience. Something you can do on a mouse and keyboard, but not on a controller. Alright, everything is looking good, but I don't like clicking the left trackpad like a D-pad. It doesn't really feel right to me, so I'm going to disable click and have the D-pad work only on touch. So I'm going to disable it requiring a click. And just for good measure, let's put reload on the other spare paddle again, because reloading, while not having to take my finger off the trackpad, is convenient. You also have to adjust the mouse speed, the gyro speed, maybe you want a different layout altogether. You can do it, and that's really cool, but this took me quite a while to figure out. Oh buddy, don't get me started on The Evil Within 2. The Evil Within 2 changed how the game handles mouse and controller input, so now it has jitter when swapping the inputs between mouse and controller. So to get around this, I have to map every key on the keyboard to the controller equivalent. But some PC games like to use the whole keyboard and separate buttons into two keys that were only one button on controller. So you have to map some things with some liberties, which also requires you to look at the key mapping, and it's not fun. And that's the biggest thing holding this controller back. You can have anything from a game immediately supporting your controller to being a spreadsheet. Now, as a Monster Hunter fan, I think spreadsheets are fun when the right keys are jingled in front of my face, but I'm fully aware that most of you are normal human beings that don't like this sort of thing. I'm really not someone that will argue that PC gaming is inaccessible and confusing. I really think if you like games, it's good to know what makes them tick. I think you get more from the experience that way. Like, knowing how a movie was made can make you appreciate it more, but something like this is more of a hindrance. Like, yeah, cool, I know the game doesn't like having two inputs at once, thanks. Now I know the devs never intended me to play the game like this. This does nothing for me. I could really keep on going on about this, but that's really all the negatives for me personally. I always thought I'd like this thing when I first saw it, and I couldn't buy one at all for a reasonable price, and they didn't ship to Canada by the time I wanted one. But now that I have it, and the negatives are all like minor annoyances to me because I'm weird and I kind of like things that need my help to get them working, this thing has more positives than it does negatives for me. It's a niche product for sure. Having only one analog stick definitely makes this thing exclusive to games that would make use of a mouse or shooter games. I don't play many RTS games or sim games that would make use of this, so it's even more niche for me in a sense. But funny enough, part of the reason these videos have been taking a while to get out is because I have very bad tendonitis right now in my right arm, which makes using a mouse and keyboard painful. So if it's a bit too much for today and I haven't been working out or something, I can play a game with this, and it's not as accurate as an actual mouse and keyboard, but it feels so much better than a controller. It's super comfortable and I can set it up the way I want it. Really, this controller can be anything you want it to be as long as the game doesn't hate it violently enough to make it feel like you wasted your money on this thing. This thing is kind of like the opposite of the Steam Machine while being almost exactly the same thing at the same time. The Steam Machine was a horribly marketed item that could have succeeded if it wasn't such a bad value. It was horribly communicated as to what it even was, and it was targeting a demographic that had no clue what it was buying. There was no way this thing wasn't going to fail. They tied the very idea of this thing to a concrete block and threw it into the river to see if it would float like a goddamn witch. But the Steam controller was a good idea. It was marketed to the right crowd, and it was tailor-made to the niche market it was for. It was a genuinely great idea, and it was actually, like, useful. Issue being, it was sold exclusively through Steam, wasn't really marketed well, despite being shown to the right people, and wasn't really given the proper support it needed from developers because, like, why are you gonna support this weird controller? Apparently it sold about 1 million units in 2016 and had about 27,000 active users monthly, which is pretty good, but compare that to like controllers people actually care about, and you can guarantee that that number has almost certainly gone down exponentially since 2016. Unlike the Steam Machine though, this thing was officially supported all the way until 2019 where it was discontinued. Now don't think that this thing is entirely useless, the Steam backend still supports this thing, clearly. Like, I'm using it. It still has all the community-made controller layouts, and people are still making them for new games to this day. Though their quality can be very hit or miss, so you might want to get used to making your own configs if you ever buy one of these things, if you even find one for a reasonable price. But if you're like most people, I can't really recommend this thing to people for a lot of reasons, most of which are that it's not really available for purchase anymore, and the rest are that, well, controllers have just come a long way the past few years with gyro support. Gyro support has the same problem as the Steam controller, where you'll map the gyro on your like PS4 controller to the mouse input, and well, some games just don't like that. The Steam controller itself still has its exclusive uses now because of those really cool trackpads, and I really hope they make another one since the Steam Deck is doing so well. A lot of people have been exposed to how good the trackpads are. They're even better on the Steam Deck actually, but that's a topic for another video soon. So yeah, that was a Steam controller. I thought it was cool.